there's a specific moment worth paying attention to. The second, right after someone says out loud what they were only supposed to carry inside. Maybe it's a plan, a decision, a quiet hope they'd been protecting for weeks. The words leave their mouth. The other person nods, maybe even smiles, and something shifts. Not outside, inside. A kind of stillness that used to feel solid now feels thinner, like a coat that was warm a minute ago and suddenly isn't. Nobody stole anything from them. No one argued, no one criticized, no one did a single hostile thing, and yet they feel lighter in the worst possible way, emptied rather than free. This is the cost nobody warns you about. Speaking something before it's finished forming doesn't share your strength. It spends it. The idea hasn't changed one bit, but something in the person telling it has already loosened its grip. Think about the last time you felt genuinely unstoppable about something, a decision, a change you were finally ready to make. Chances are that feeling was strongest in the hour before you told anyone. The moment restraint might have served you best. Not because people around you meant harm, because certain kinds of power are sacred precisely because they're private, and the instant they're witnessed, they start operating under different rules that have very little to do with truth and a lot to do with performance. This isn't a call to isolate yourself, to trust no one, to carry everything alone forever. It's something narrower and far more useful. Learning to recognize which sentences are still too young to survive open air. Because the next question isn't really about whether to speak, it's about what actually happens. In that private inner world, the instant another person becomes a witness to something that was never asking to be seen yet. Picture two versions of the exact same idea. In the first, it exists only inside someone's head, untested, unspoken, still soft at the edges, still theirs, completely. In the second, that same idea now lives inside someone else's head too, because it got said out loud over coffee, or in a text message, or during a moment that felt safe enough to open up. Same idea, same words, even. But the second version is no longer fully owned by the person who had it first. This is the part most people miss when they talk about oversharing. They think the danger is judgment, gossip, someone using the information against them later. Sometimes that happens, sure, but the deeper shift is quieter than betrayal. The moment another person becomes aware of your inner world, that world stops being purely yours to shape. It now has to survive their reaction, their opinion, their face when you told them, whether they meant to influence you or not. Try this instead. Next time something matters enough to protect, write it down before you say it out loud to anyone. Not to share it later, to let it exist somewhere private first, fully formed, before it has to face another person's eyes. Journaling serves this exact function, and so does simply sitting with a decision for a few days before naming it to someone else. The idea gets a chance to finish becoming itself, instead of being shaped halfway through by someone else's expression. None of this means secrecy for its own sake, or treating every person close to you like a threat. It means understanding that being witnessed changes the thing being witnessed. The same way a shy animal behaves differently the moment it senses eyes on it. And once you notice that shift happening in real time, in your own chest, a much harder question starts to surface. What if the problem was never other people finding out? What if it was something you were doing to yourself every time you asked for applause before the work was even done? There's an old assumption almost everyone carries, without ever questioning it, that criticism is what kills a plan. Someone doubts you, someone laughs, someone points out every flaw. and the project quietly dies under the weight of that disapproval. That story feels true because it's dramatic. But if you actually look back at the plans that never happened in your own life, criticism is rarely the real culprit. Applause is. Here's how it plays out, almost every time. Someone shares an idea that's still half-formed, a business, a move to a new city, a complete change of direction, and the room lights up. That's amazing. You're going to crush it. I'm so proud of you already. And something strange happens inside the person who spoke. A small, quiet part of them relaxes, as if the work were already done. The praise gets metabolized as progress, even though nothing has actually moved except air in a room. Think of it like rust forming on metal before it's even had the chance to harden. The compliment lands too early, while the plan is still soft, still shapeless, still entirely dependent on follow-through, and that early praise creates a strange sense of completion. The brain, remarkably, doesn't always distinguish between being congratulated for finishing something and being congratulated for merely announcing it. Both light up the same reward system. Both can quietly kill momentum. If there's a next step here, it's this. Protect plans, the way you'd protect something still curing, still setting. Let the excitement stay inside for a while. Tell fewer people, and only after there's something real to show, not just something real to imagine. Because the real danger was never the person who doubted you out loud. It was the version of you that already felt finished, the moment someone else got excited on your behalf. Every person has at least one fear they've handed to someone else, hoping it would feel lighter once it wasn't theirs alone anymore. It rarely works that way. Say a private fear out loud to someone without the depth to actually hold it, and something strange happens on the way back. The fear returns heavier than it left, dressed up in someone else's anxiety, someone else's worst-case scenario, someone else's nervous energy layered on top of your own. This isn't about secrecy or distrust. It's about understanding what a fear actually needs in order to shrink instead of grow. A fear spoken to the wrong person doesn't get examined. It gets amplified because most people, out of love or panic or simple discomfort, respond to fear with more fear. They ask the questions that make it bigger. They imagine the worst right alongside you. And now, there are two people carrying a weight that was only ever meant to be worked through, not multiplied. Think of it like sound in an empty room. Say something quietly to a wall that absorbs it, and it stays small. Say it into a space built to echo, and it comes back louder than it left your mouth. Certain people, certain relationships, certain moments, they're echo chambers for fear, not containers for it. The skill isn't finding someone to dump the fear onto. It's learning to recognize, before you speak, whether the person in front of you tends to absorb or amplify. None of this means fear should be carried entirely alone forever, hidden from everyone, festering in silence. It means being far more selective about timing, about who, about when a fear is ready to be spoken, versus when it's still asking to be understood first, by the one person who actually created it in the first place. So what do you actually do with a fear if handing it to the wrong person only makes it heavier? The answer isn't dramatic, and it definitely isn't quick. It's sitting with it, not suppressing it, not pretending it isn't there, not distracting yourself until it goes quiet out of exhaustion. Actually staying in the room with the feeling long enough to hear what it's trying to say, instead of rushing to unload it onto the first available person. This looks different depending on the person, but a few practices show up again and again in anyone who's genuinely good at this. journaling without an audience, writing the fear out longhand, not to reread later, not to post anywhere, just to get it out of the body and onto a page where it can be looked at instead of just felt. Sitting in silence for 10 or 15 minutes with nothing to distract from the discomfort. Letting the fear speak in full before responding to it. Walking alone, no music, no phone, just movement, and the thought that keeps circling back. What tends to happen if you actually stay with a fear instead of immediately handing it off is that it starts to specify itself. A vague, overwhelming dread about everything falling apart slowly narrows down into something far more precise, a fear about one conversation, one decision, one specific outcome. And precise fears are almost always more manageable than vague ones, because you can actually do something about a fear that has a shape. This kind of stillness isn't comfortable, especially at first. Most people reach for their phone, a friend, a distraction, the instant something uncomfortable rises up. But the ones who get good at sitting with it eventually notice something else starting to shift, not just around their fears, but around the things they used to announce before they were even ready to walk away from. Picture someone standing at the door of a room they've finally decided to leave, a job, a relationship, a version of their life that stopped fitting a long time ago. The decision feels solid, settled. Then, right before they walk out, someone asks a single question. Are you sure? And just like that, the door swings back open. Not because the doubt was convincing, because it was said out loud by someone else at the exact moment the decision was still fresh enough to bruise. This is what happens almost every time an exit gets announced before it gets executed. The moment you tell people you're leaving, you invite their opinions into a decision that was never theirs to make. Most of those opinions come from a good place: concern, love, fear on your behalf. But concern from someone else has a way of leaking into your own certainty, especially if that certainty was only a few days old to begin with. One raised eyebrow, one, "Are you sure?" And suddenly you're relitigating something you'd already settled internally. The people who actually follow through on major exits, leaving a career, ending something that no longer serves them, walking away from a life that looked fine on paper but felt hollow inside, tend to share one habit. They don't announce the exit. They complete it quietly and explain it afterward, if at all. The decision gets made in private, executed in private, and only becomes public once it's no longer reversible by someone else's doubt. This isn't about deception or cutting people out. It's about protecting a decision during the only window where it's actually fragile, the space between deciding and doing. Because once that door is closed for good, nobody's question can pull you back through it. But while it's still cracked open, even the most well-meaning voice in the world can be the reason you never actually leave. There's a particular kind of joy that exists for exactly as long as it stays private. The quiet satisfaction of having done something difficult, something that mattered, without needing a single other person to confirm it was real. The moment that achievement gets announced, something subtle happens to that joy. It doesn't disappear. It changes shape. It stops being simply felt and starts being something that has to be maintained, defended, proven again, for whoever's now watching. Congratulations. As good as they feel in the moment, carry a strange side effect most people never notice happening in real time. External recognition has a way of attaching itself to identity. You're so disciplined. You're so successful. I always knew you'd do this. And once that label exists in someone else's mouth, there's a quiet pressure to keep earning it. What used to be a private win, done for its own sake, slowly turns into a performance that needs an audience to keep validating it. This is why some of the most fulfilled people tend to share their wins selectively, and often much later than they achieved them. Not out of arrogance or secrecy, but because they've learned that unguarded joy, the kind that doesn't need anyone else's reaction to feel complete, is rare and worth protecting for as long as possible before it becomes something to prove. None of this means achievements should never be shared, or that celebrating with others is somehow wrong. It means noticing the exact moment when a private joy starts needing external permission to still count as real, because that moment says something important about what's actually being carried underneath all of it, quietly, waiting to be named. Picture a small flame, just lit, still fragile enough that a single gust of wind could put it out entirely. Nobody builds that flame outdoors, exposed, hoping it survives the weather. They shield it first, cup their hands around it, carry it somewhere still, let it grow strong enough to withstand what it eventually has to face. Everything discussed so far, the plans, the fears, the exits, the wins, follows this exact same law, even though almost nobody thinks of it in these terms. What's still forming needs shelter, not an audience. A plan that's 2 days old is that flame. A decision to leave something behind, still warm from being made, is that flame. A private joy that hasn't been tested by anyone else's opinion yet, still that same flame. None of these things are weak. They're simply young, and young things die from exposure far more often than they die from opposition. This is the single principle underneath every idea covered until now. Protection isn't secrecy for its own sake, and it isn't distrust of the people around you. It's timing. It's understanding that some things need to hit a certain strength, a certain shape, before they can survive being seen, questioned, congratulated, or doubted by anyone else, including people who love you and mean you no harm at all. Once this principle actually settles in, a strange kind of confidence starts to build. Not the loud kind that needs to announce itself, but something steadier underneath. And that shift raises a much bigger question than any single plan or fear or exit ever could. What happens to a person who starts living this way permanently, protecting their inner fire as a habit rather than an exception? There are two kinds of silence that look identical from the outside but come from entirely different places. The first is protective, the silence of someone still forming a plan, still nursing a fear, still guarding something too fragile to expose yet. That silence has fear underneath it. It exists because speaking too soon has cost something before, and the person has learned, sometimes the hard way, to wait. This is the silence that's been the subject of everything up to this point. The second kind of silence is different in a way that's easy to miss at first. This one doesn't come from fear of exposure. It comes from having nothing left that needs defending. Someone who's reached this stage isn't staying quiet, because a plan might get ruined, or a fear might get amplified, or a win might turn into a performance. They're quiet because none of that pressure exists inside them anymore. There's simply nothing urgent left to prove. This shift tends to show up gradually, almost without the person noticing it happening. Where they once felt the urge to explain a decision, justify a choice, or make sure someone understood their reasoning, that urge slowly starts to fade. Not from apathy, from a kind of settledness that no longer needs outside agreement to feel valid. The explaining stops because the need behind the explaining stops first. This is the quiet worth aiming for, eventually. Not silence as armor, but silence as evidence that nothing inside is asking to be rescued, understood, or approved of by anyone standing nearby. And once that kind of stillness becomes natural instead of forced, something else starts to happen, something that has very little to do with what a person says, and everything to do with how they occupy a room without saying anything at all. Somewhere along this path, a shift happens that most people never consciously notice in themselves, though they notice it instantly in others. A person reaches a point where they are no longer understood through what they explain, defend, or announce. They're understood through how they occupy a room, the steadiness in how they listen, the absence of urgency in how they respond, the sense that nothing needs to be proven, because nothing inside them is asking for permission anymore. This is the natural endpoint of everything covered so far. The plans that were protected long enough to survive, the fears that were sat with instead of handed away, the exits that were completed quietly before being explained, the wins that stayed private, long enough to still feel like enough on their own. None of it was about secrecy for its own sake. It was about timing, about shelter, about letting things become fully themselves before exposing them to a world that always has an opinion ready. What's left, after all that practice, is a kind of presence that doesn't need volume to be felt. Walk into a room like that, and people notice something shifts, even if they can't name exactly what. It isn't charisma in the performative sense. It's the simple, rare absence of someone trying to convince anyone of anything, including themselves. So here's what's worth sitting with now. After everything shared here, what are you still explaining to people that you no longer actually need to explain? What's still being announced, defended, or proven out of habit, not necessity? Because the version of you that no longer needs any of that isn't somewhere far away. It's just quieter than the version doing all the talking right now.